Today, we'll look into the case of a young mother who went out to celebrate New Year's Eve and never came home. Police uncovered unsettling clues but were unable to solve the mystery, until 35 years later, when a long-awaited breakthrough finally revealed what had happened to her on that tragic New Year's Day. Tanya McKinley was born on January 25, 1961, in the small town of Milton, Florida. Raised in a loving home, she shared a close bond with her older sister, and the two spent much of their childhood playing outdoors, skateboarding, and bowling together. After graduating from high school, Tanya moved about 25 miles away to Pensacola. Determined to build a career in healthcare, she pursued one of the fastest paths into the medical field, becoming a medical transcriptionist. No medical degree was necessary for the job, only specialized training courses. Tanya's cousin Vernita decided to move with her, and the two shared an apartment to cut down on expenses. Before long, Tanya met a man named Tim, and the two began dating. Their relationship grew more serious, and they eventually moved in together. In 1983, they welcomed a son, Timothy. Though Tanya was overjoyed to be a mother, her relationship with Tim was far from ideal. Frequent arguments strained their bond, and about a year after Timothy's birth, the couple separated. By the end of 1984, Tanya temporarily moved in with her cousin, who is now married with 2 children of her own. Tanya hoped to find a place for herself and planned to move out as soon as she could. On December 31st, Tanya joined Vernita and her husband to celebrate New Year's Eve at a local bar. They had left their children at a late-night daycare and were ready to ring in the new year. The evening was lively, full of laughter, dancing, and familiar faces as they awaited the stroke of midnight. When midnight arrived and the new year of 1985 began, Vernita and her husband prepared to head home. The daycare where they had left their kids closed at 1 a.m., giving them only an hour to pick them up. Tanya, however, wanted to linger at the bar a little longer, having spent most of her time focused on work and caring for her son. For the past 2 years, this had been Tanya's only chance to unwind and relax, so she didn't want to miss it. She asked her sister to pick up her son from daycare, and Vernita agreed. Since they lived together and Vernita also had to collect her own children, it wasn't a problem. Before leaving, Vernita asked Tanya how she planned to get home, as they had driven together to the bar. Tanya reassured her that she would easily find someone to give her a ride. The next morning, January 1st, Vernita woke up to find that Tanya still hadn't returned. It seemed unusual, as she should have been home long ago. At first, Vernita assumed Tanya might have stayed over at a friend's place, so she wasn't immediately alarmed. But everything changed soon after. Vernita, growing increasingly worried, was shocked when her mother-in-law knocked on their door with devastating news. Tanya had been found dead. Around 3 a.m., a Pensacola resident and her daughter had gone to a veterinary clinic due to an urgent issue with their dog. As they left home, the daughter noticed something unusual on the roadside. She initially thought it was a mannequin and mentioned it to her mother. Upon taking a closer look, the woman was horrified to realize it was a human body. She immediately returned home and called the police. When officers arrived, they discovered the body of a young woman lying in an empty lot near the road. Her tights were pulled down, her dress lifted, and her shoes were missing. Next to the victim, police found a blue towel stained with red marks resembling blood. The deceased was quickly identified as 23-year-old Tanya McKinley. A few streets away, officers recovered her shoes and a purse containing her ID. The body was taken to medical experts, while investigators continued to scrutinize the crime scene. It soon became clear that Tanya had likely been killed elsewhere. There was no blood near her body aside from the stains on the towel, and marks on the ground suggested that her body had been dragged from the road to the roadside atop the towel. Investigators uncovered their first potential leads: several human hairs, pubic hairs, and dog fur. They suspected that the human and pubic hairs belonged to the perpetrator, who may also have owned a dog. Medical examiners determined that Tanya had suffered a blow to the head with a heavy object, but the official cause of death was strangulation. They also confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted. A semen sample was collected from her body, but at that time, DNA analysis was not commonly used in forensics. The only detail investigators could ascertain was that the suspect had type B blood. With these clues yielding no immediate leads, detectives began compiling a list of potential suspects. Their attention first turned to Tim, Tanya's ex-boyfriend. Speaking with her family and friends, Police learned about the ongoing tensions and frequent arguments in their relationship, both before and after the birth of their son. It became clear that Tim had been opposed when Tanya decided to end things. Tim had refused to accept the breakup and continued trying to win Tanya back. He frequently called her, showed up unannounced, and acted as though he couldn't let the relationship end. Investigators considered the possibility that on New Year's Eve, Tim might have followed Tanya to the bar, resulting in a confrontation that escalated to murder. They brought him in for questioning, but he denied any involvement. Tim agreed to provide hair samples, but while DNA could not be extracted, experts compared the hairs under a microscope. The analysis revealed significant differences between Tim's hair and the hairs found on Tanya's body and the towel. Based on this, he was temporarily ruled out as a suspect. Investigators then broadened their focus to include everyone who had been at the bar that New Year's Eve. Investigators questioned Vernita about anyone who might have acted strangely or aggressively toward Tanya that evening, but she insisted the night had passed without incident and everything went smoothly. The police also learned that after breaking up with her boyfriend, Tanya had briefly dated a man named Kurt, who happened to be the bartender at the same bar where she celebrated New Year's, and it was his shift that night. When questioned, Kurt denied any involvement in the murder. He claimed that after finishing his shift, he attended a New Year's party with friends. Interviews with those friends revealed an interesting detail. While they confirmed Kurt had been at the party, he had not arrived immediately after leaving the bar. Considering all testimonies, police concluded that, in theory, Kurt had enough time to commit the crime. After conducting multiple interviews with people from the bar, detectives determined that Tanya was last seen alive at 1:15 a.m., but no one witnessed her leaving the premises. Police also spoke with residents near the location where her body was found. One family recalled driving by around 2 a.m. and were certain the body was not there at that time. Investigators concluded that Tanya was likely killed within roughly an hour and a half of being last seen alive. Kurt did not have a solid alibi for that specific window. He agreed to take a polygraph test, but the results were inconclusive, showing deceptive responses to some questions. However, lab analysis confirmed that his blood type did not match the killer's type as determined from the semen sample, and he was subsequently removed from the list of suspects. Police continued searching for other potential suspects, but every lead quickly ran cold. The killer's semen could not be analyzed, and investigators lacked substantial evidence or witnesses, leaving them at a dead end. The only detail they were fairly certain of was that the perpetrator likely lived near the area where Tanya's body was discovered. The location was secluded, situated on the outskirts of a large residential neighborhood. Police believed it was unlikely that an outsider would know enough about the area to transport the victim there without prior familiarity. The case remained unsolved for many years. Tanya's son, Timothy, who was just 18 months old at the time, was raised by both his father and Tanya's family. They all chose to shield Timothy from the truth about his mother's death. As he grew up, relatives told him that Tanya had died in a car accident. This continued until he turned 14. With Christmas approaching, Timothy became curious about a gift his father had prepared for him. While searching through his father's closet, he stumbled upon something far more disturbing than a present. He discovered a letter his father had written to the popular TV host Montel Williams, asking him to publicize Tanya's unsolved murder in hopes of generating leads. The letter contained detailed accounts of the crime, revealing to Timothy the true fate of his mother in the early 2000s. The local police department reopened Tanya's case, hoping that advances in DNA analysis could finally identify the killer. They sent all available evidence to the lab, and experts determined that the blood on the blue towel found near her body did not belong to Tanya, but to an unknown man. They obtained his DNA profile and uploaded it to the FBI database, but no matches were found. The case went cold again until 2015, exactly 30 years after the murder. With the killer's DNA still unmatched in the FBI database, detectives pursued a new strategy. Modern technology allowed them to search not only for exact matches, but also for partial ones, considering the possibility that relatives of the perpetrator might be in the database, which could ultimately lead them to the suspect. Investigators began searching the database and eventually focused on a specific individual whose DNA shared some similarities with the sample from Tanya's killer, though the match was weak. Police investigated his family background and even contacted his relatives, who agreed to provide DNA samples for comparison. After testing, experts reached a disappointing conclusion. The family had no connection to the suspect, leaving detectives once again without any solid leads. In 2018, journalist Tony Adam, though not a crime specialist, became personally interested in the case. Drawn to the unsolved murder of Tanya, he reached out to the investigators in hopes of assisting with the investigation. Detectives viewed his offer to help with some skepticism, since Tony had no background in criminal investigations. Yet, given the case's long stagnation, they concluded he couldn't make things worse. The journalist became involved, building strong connections with Tanya's family, who recognized his sincere dedication and the considerable effort he invested in the case. He worked to generate media coverage, bringing renewed public attention to the decades-old investigation, and offered a fresh perspective. By 2019, detectives decided to try again to identify the killer's relatives, this time enlisting the expertise of Parabon, a company specializing in genetic genealogy, after their previous attempt had fallen short. Previously, investigators had only searched for potential relatives through the FBI database, which included DNA from various criminals. Parabon, however, accessed public genetic databases with a much wider scope, where anyone could upload their DNA to explore ancestry or find relatives. Experts meticulously analyzed the potential family trees of individuals related to the suspect, searching for someone who matched their criteria. They were looking for a man who, in 1985, was old enough to commit the crime and lived in the area. This painstaking process took nearly a year, but by February 2020, they identified a promising candidate, 57-year-old Daniel Wells, who had resided in the same city at the time of Tanya's murder. Detectives investigated Wells' history and discovered that he had drawn police attention several times in the late 1980s, including arrests for assault and indecent exposure. By 2020, Daniel lived in Pensacola with his wife and children, working as a carpenter. However, to confirm any connection to Tanya's murder, investigators needed his DNA for a direct comparison with the killer's profile. Lacking solid evidence, the police acted cautiously, concerned that Wells might flee if he realized he was under suspicion. Their opportunity came when Daniel casually discarded a cigarette, but near his workplace. Authorities collected it and promptly sent it to the lab for analysis. Forensic experts successfully extracted DNA from the saliva on the cigarette, and compared it to the killer's DNA from Tanya's case. The results revealed a perfect match. After 35 years, the authorities had finally identified the perpetrator, and Daniel Wells was arrested that same day. Although the DNA evidence was conclusive, investigators wanted a confession and decided to proceed carefully, withholding the full extent of their findings. They instructed patrol officers to stop Daniel under the guise of a routine ID check. Once he was approached, detectives told him he needed to come to the station, keeping the situation controlled and ambiguous. During questioning, they gradually steered the conversation toward Tanya's murder, asking Daniel about his activities on that fateful night. At first, Daniel denied ever knowing Tanya. Detectives then revealed that his DNA had been recovered from the crime scene. As they pressed him, his denials became increasingly strained. The investigators stressed the irrefutable nature of the DNA evidence, making it clear that denial would not help him avoid consequences. Faced with overwhelming proof, Daniel eventually began to speak. He initially attempted to rationalize the DNA's presence, claiming he might have been intimate with Tanya that night. Detectives rejected this explanation and pressed for the full truth. Ultimately, Daniel admitted to murdering Tanya. However, the details of his account from that New Year's Eve raised troubling questions about his actions and motives. Daniel confessed that he had been at the bar where he encountered Tanya, who mentioned needing a ride home. He offered to drive her to his house. Once there, they reportedly drank and engaged in consensual sexual activity. According to Daniel, an argument suddenly erupted, though he claimed he could not recall its exact cause. The confrontation escalated, and in a fit of rage, he struck Tanya on the head with a heavy wooden cutting board. Realizing she was dead, Daniel panicked. He transported her body to the spot where it was later discovered, discarded some of her belongings along the way, and returned home. When questioned about the dog hairs found on the towel and Tanya's clothing, he explained that they came from his roommate's black Labrador. Daniel's version of events clearly appeared self-serving, attempting to portray the encounter as consensual and the killing as accidental. Yet medical evidence contradicted key parts of his story, Most notably, the cause of death was strangulation, not solely the head injury. A more likely reconstruction suggests that Daniel attempted to assault Tanya, and when she resisted, he struck her with the cutting board. Realizing she was still alive, he then strangled her to ensure she would not survive. Even though his confession didn't fully match the forensic findings, it, combined with the DNA evidence and other investigative results, gave detectives sufficient grounds to formally charge Daniel with murder and place him in custody. For Tanya's family, the revelation brought a mix of relief and sorrow. After 35 long years of uncertainty and unanswered questions, they finally knew the truth about what had happened that New Year's Eve. Her son, Timothy, and other relatives were able to confront the reality of her death, even though justice in the legal sense was denied. Daniel's suicide, just 2 weeks after his arrest, robbed them of the chance to see him held accountable in court. Still, the case's resolution allowed Tanya's loved ones a measure of closure. After decades of anguish and unanswered questions, they finally learned the full story and could begin the long process of healing. A young girl set out to visit a friend, but never arrived. Initially, investigators couldn't uncover a single lead, and the case went cold for many years. It always seemed as though the truth was within reach, yet no one could connect the dots. Then, decades later, everything shifted, and the mystery unraveled in a way no one had imagined. Clare Tiltman was born on January 14, 1977, in the quiet English village of Greenhithe. As an only child, she attended an all-girls school where she made plenty of friends. From an early age, Clare showed determination and focus, dreaming of becoming one of the nation's first female firefighters. During her high school years, she even volunteered at charity events run by the local fire brigade. Clare helped out in any way she could, but she still hoped to earn a college degree before pursuing that career path. In January 1993, at just 16 years old, she was busy with her final exams while also planning her future studies. On January 18th, only 4 days after celebrating her birthday, Clare set off to visit a friend. The two intended to discuss their college plans and consider where they might apply. She left home around 6 p.m., assuring her mother she'd return within an hour and a half. When that time passed with no sign of her, her mother assumed Clare had simply lost track of time or lingered longer at her friend's house. But as the clock moved past 8 p.m., her concern began to grow. She first phoned Clare's friend, only to learn that Clare had never arrived. Thinking plans might have changed, she began reaching out to some of Clare's other friends, but none of them had seen her that evening. Not long after, she stepped outside and encountered a neighbor who mentioned that an incident had taken place a few miles away, with ambulances and several police cars gathered at the scene. By then, Clare's mother was deeply alarmed. She went straight to the local police station to report her daughter missing, providing a detailed description. But instead of taking the report, officers told her to return home. They explained there had been an incident and assured her someone would come by soon to clarify. A short time later, police knocked on her door and delivered the devastating news. No parent ever imagines being told their daughter was found dead only hours earlier. That same evening, 2 men were driving along a road linking several nearby towns. As they passed a row of houses, they spotted a girl kneeling on the roadside and pulled over to see if she needed help. The moment they got closer, it was clear something was terribly wrong. She was gasping for breath and appeared completely disoriented. One of the men rushed to a nearby pub to call for help, while the other stayed by her side. At first, he suspected she might have been struck by a car, given how close she was to the road. He tried to comfort her, but her condition rapidly declined. Within minutes, she stopped breathing, and by the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late. Clare's body was taken to the medical examiner, and the findings were devastating. She had been stabbed 9 times, most likely with a large knife, though there was no indication of sexual assault. At the same time, investigators began processing the scene and quickly determined where the attack had taken place. It appeared Clare had been ambushed in a narrow alley branching off the main road. She was walking toward her friend's house. The nature of her injuries suggested the killer struck from behind. Beyond that, however, there was little to work with. The alley was dark, quiet, and deserted. No cameras, no witnesses, no meaningful evidence left behind. Still, one detail stood out. The medical examiner noted that the weapon wasn't an ordinary knife. It was unusually large. The The knife was far too large to be something casually carried in a pocket. Detectives suspected the killer had brought it from home, already intending to use it. News of the murder spread rapidly throughout Clare's village and neighboring towns. That same evening, students still at school for exam preparations heard about the tragedy over the radio. At first, the victim's identity remained unknown, but it didn't take long before word spread that it was Clare. With no strong leads, police appealed to the public for information. A handful of witnesses reported seeing a man in a light-colored coat near the road around 7 p.m. Another claimed to have spotted a man with dark, curly hair leaving the alleyway. Unfortunately, none of them could put a name to either figure. Although it was a small community where most people were familiar with one another, detectives couldn't rule out the idea that Clare's killer might have known her and acted out of personal motive. Yet there was also a far darker possibility, that this wasn't an isolated crime at all. Investigators feared they might be facing a repeat offender, possibly even a serial predator. Back in December 1988, for years before Clare's death, a 27-year-old woman was attacked by a stranger while walking home from work. Armed with both a gun and a knife, he abducted her and drove her out of town, where he attempted to assault her. He then stabbed her 5 times and left her for dead. Incredibly, she managed to survive. Despite her wounds and the freezing temperatures, she managed to crawl to a nearby road, where a group of workers eventually found her. After spending 9 days in intensive care, doctors were able to save her life. But police never succeeded in identifying her attacker. Following Clare's murder, both investigators and locals began to wonder if the same man could be responsible for both crimes. A few days later, Clare's funeral took place, drawing hundreds from the community. Before the service, her parents told reporters they suspected the killer might attend. Detectives shared the same concern, so they observed the ceremony carefully, discreetly watching and noting everyone in attendance. Yet even then, no new clues emerged, and the case remained unsolved. In the weeks that followed, police continued questioning locals and pursuing every possible lead, but none of it led anywhere. More than 2 years slipped by, and it began to feel like Clare's case would remain unsolved forever. Gradually, people stopped discussing what had happened. Then, everything shifted. On October 17, 1995, a local woman walking home from work was attacked just a few hundred yards from the spot where Clare had been stabbed. The man struck her with a knife, but when she screamed and fell, he bolted, fleeing the scene. Though injured, the woman survived. Yet again, detectives found themselves stuck. She hadn't seen his face or noticed any defining features, since he had come at her from behind. This time, however, investigators caught a break. A witness reported seeing a white Ford in the area, one that had some distinctive modifications. That detail allowed investigators to quickly identify the car's owner, a local milkman named Colin. Police immediately remembered they had spoken with him before, shortly after Clare's murder. At the time, he had phoned in a tip, claiming he'd seen a man with dark hair near the crime scene. But when detectives later followed up in person, his story had shifted. Initially, Colin said he'd been driving along that road around 6:30 p.m. Now he insisted it had actually been closer to 5:30. He did, however, have an alibi. His mother claimed they'd been driving together and were already home by the time Clare was attacked. Still, suspicion began to mount. Colin owned the same white Ford witnesses had reported near the later assault, and he was often seen wearing a light-colored trench coat, the very description multiple witnesses gave after both attacks. He also had light-colored hair, and 2 separate witnesses had reported seeing a fair-haired man near the alley where Clare was killed. That was enough for detectives to treat him as a prime suspect and obtain a warrant to search his home. Inside, they discovered a large knife consistent with the wounds on the most recent victim. But that was only the beginning. During the search, investigators also uncovered a hidden journal, and its contents were chilling. In it, Colin confessed to attacking the woman back in 1988. He described the assault as his masterpiece, and even rated it, boasting that it was a 95% success. When he later learned the victim had survived, he wrote that next time he would make sure to do better. He also described an attempt to sneak into a care home with the intent to kill someone, though he admitted the plan had fallen through. Even more unsettling, he wrote that after the first attack, some of his friends had jokingly nicknamed him a killer because of his fixation with knives. He even admitted to threatening his first victim, warning her that if she ever gave police his description, he would target someone else. Colin also confessed to the 1995 stabbing. In his journal, he explained that he'd gotten into an argument with his girlfriend that day, convinced she was being unfaithful. Consumed by rage, he drove around searching for someone to take it out on. At first, he considered attacking a man, but decided it was too risky. Then he saw a woman walking alone, pulled over, and launched the attack. He wrote that after the attack, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief and didn't care in the slightest whether his victim lived or died. The diary also outlined plans for future killings and revealed that he had broken into the homes of several women he knew while they were away. When police searched Colin's car, they discovered blood-stained clothing and a torn piece of a tie, which he had apparently used in an attempt to strangle his first victim. That evidence alone was more than enough to charge him for the attacks on both women. Detectives also strongly suspected him of killing Claire and began searching for a direct link. It didn't take long to find one. Colin's family was acquainted with Claire's, and both had spent time at the same local community center where neighbors often gathered. In fact, Claire had celebrated her birthday at the community center just 4 days before her death, and Colin had been there that same evening. Investigators also confirmed he attended her funeral. Still, there was no concrete evidence directly tying him to her murder. While Colin remained in custody, detectives interrogated him, but he denied any involvement. Instead, he offered his own theory. He claimed the killer might have been a man who used to play pool with Claire at the community center. According to Colin, this man left town soon after the murder, and the last time he saw him was at Claire's funeral. Police eventually tracked the man down, but he didn't match any of the witness descriptions of the figure seen near the crime scene. Colin, on the other hand, fit the descriptions almost perfectly, but investigators still lacked the evidence needed to tie him conclusively to Claire's murder. In December 1996, he was charged only for the 2 other attacks, from 1988 and 1995. He pled guilty and received 3 life sentences, though he would be eligible for parole after just 15 years. Still, detectives weren't ready to let the matter rest. They continued searching for anything that might finally bring justice for Claire. Among all the possible suspects, Colin remained the most convincing. Yet 2 major obstacles stood in the way: the absence of physical evidence and his alibi. As you may recall, his mother had told police that she and Colin were out delivering flyers and were already home by the time Claire was attacked. Here's the catch. Colin had called police the very next day, claiming he'd seen a dark-haired man near the crime scene about an hour after the murder. But that statement directly contradicted his supposed alibi. If his account were true, it meant he had been right by the alley at the exact time Claire was attacked. That contradiction set detectives thinking. Could his mother have been lying to protect him? She wasn't just any parent. She had worked as a political party advisor, as had her husband, and at the time she was also serving as the town's mayor. When police pressed the parents again, they stood firm, insisting Colin had no involvement. But detectives refused to let go, and their persistence eventually led them to the real truth. Colin's alibi unraveled completely. Investigators uncovered solid proof that his mother hadn't been with him that evening, meaning she had lied to shield him. But that wasn't the only disturbing revelation. They also discovered that Colin's father had disposed of a knife his son brought home after the 1995 attack. He admitted to boiling it in water, dismantling it, and discarding the pieces. Just hours before police arrived with a search warrant, he was sentenced to 12 months in prison. Colin's mother, however, wasn't finished. Later, in a local TV interview, she admitted that it had actually been her idea for her husband to get rid of the knife. She explained that she genuinely believed her son was innocent and acted out of fear. Police worried that Colin's parents were trying to frame the situation as though authorities might pin someone else's crime on him. Yet even with everything uncovered, investigators still lacked the evidence needed to charge him with Claire's murder. While he served his sentence for the other attacks, detectives kept combing through his past, hoping to find anything that would finally connect him to the crime. But nothing substantial ever surfaced. The only new development came during a routine prison cell search. Officers discovered disturbing notes filled with twisted, graphic fantasies about women he knew, eerily similar to the writings in his old diary. They revealed his warped state of mind, but offered no tangible leads in Claire's case. Investigators also considered other suspects, including a local man who had murdered his own mother in 1994. After killing his mother, one suspect left behind a note claiming she had begun to suspect him of being responsible for Claire's murder. Another possible lead was serial killer Robert Napper, who had been convicted of 3 murders, but investigators were never able to find any concrete connection between him and Claire's case. From then on, the investigation largely stalled. Claire's parents remained certain Colin was the killer, and the fact that police still couldn't charge him for her murder weighed heavily on them. In 2008, Claire's mother passed away from cancer, followed by her father in 2012. Neither lived to see justice for their daughter. Then, in 2013, the case resurfaced in the public eye when detectives renewed their efforts to bring the killer to justice. They issued another appeal for information, and even the Prime Minister publicly voiced support for their campaign. The tips that came in led nowhere, until one of Colin's former cellmates came forward with a story that shifted the entire case. He claimed that Colin once bragged about attacking a girl, saying he had spotted her at a crosswalk when something inside him suddenly snapped. That detail immediately caught detectives' attention, because Claire had been using a crosswalk that led directly into the alley where she was murdered. By contrast, the other 2 known victims hadn't been attacked anywhere near crosswalks. That one detail strongly suggested Colin had been referring to Claire, or possibly another victim yet to be identified. Still, detectives doubted the latter, as no other similar unsolved cases had surfaced in the area. After speaking with the former cellmate, police obtained another warrant and searched Colin's home again, determined to finally uncover fresh evidence. As expected, the search didn't turn up any major discoveries, but one detail stood out: a newspaper clipping about Claire's murder, published a year after her death. It wasn't definitive proof of guilt, but detectives decided it was time to lay out everything they had and push for a trial. By then, a new law had come into effect in the UK. This law allowed prosecutors to present a suspect's prior convictions in court, a potential game-changer for Claire's case. Colin was already serving time for 2 violent attacks, both eerily similar to what happened to Claire and committed just a couple of miles from where she was killed. Now, in addition to that, investigators had testimony from his former cellmate and solid evidence proving Colin's alibi had been fabricated. That was finally enough for prosecutors to act. On February 12, 2014, detectives announced that Colin had been officially charged with Claire's murder. The timing was deliberate. It was the very same day his first parole hearing was set to take place. Instead of walking free, he remained behind bars while prosecutors began preparing their case. Nearly a year later, the trial finally went to court. Colin entered a not guilty plea, but by that point he had already confessed to attacking 2 other women. This time, he revealed even darker details. He admitted that when he was around 19 or 20, he began sneaking out of the house at night, armed with a knife, roaming the streets in search of someone he could kill. Colin explained that his crimes were driven by a desire to feel powerful, to have control over someone else, because he couldn't stand the idea of being seen as weak. His ex-girlfriend also testified, recalling how strangely he began acting right after Claire's murder. At the time, she assumed he was simply shaken like everyone else in town, but in hindsight, she realized there was something deeper going on. When questioned about his views on women, Colin admitted he both loved and hated them. He confessed to struggling with low self-esteem and feelings of worthlessness, which fueled his inability to trust others, especially women. He also revealed that he kept a personal arsenal at home, including 20 to 30 knives, a crossbow, and several air rifles. And apparently, his parents had always known. Colin even admitted he never left home without carrying a knife. But when it came time for his former cellmate to testify, the prosecution ran into an unexpected setback. The man claimed he couldn't clearly recall what Colin had said and admitted he might have confused the conversation with someone else. Even so, he shared one odd detail. Inmates used to joke about how Colin stabbed his victims multiple times, yet somehow missed other vital organs. It became a grim running gag among them, especially during dart games. The trial then took a sudden and tragic turn when Claire's cousin suffered a heart attack during one of the sessions and had to be rushed to the hospital. Later, the prosecution called a former mayor to testify, and he revealed something striking about Colin's mother. At the time of the investigation, she was serving as a local counselor, which gave her access to a closed police briefing. During that meeting, she persistently pressed detectives for details about a car spotted near the crime scene and demanded to know every possible detail, all while having helped her son fabricate an alibi. The behavior appeared highly suspicious. The trial stretched over 5 weeks, and in December 2014 the jury delivered its verdict. Colin was guilty of murdering Clare Tiltman. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 21 years before parole eligibility. When the verdict was read, Colin remained expressionless. He later appealed the conviction, but the court dismissed it, ruling that the evidence against him was overwhelming. After 26 long years, justice was finally achieved in Clare's case. To honor her memory, local officials named a road after her and later renamed a street with her family's surname. Then in 2022, a new community center was opened, proudly carrying the name of Clare Tiltman. Two young girls set out on their scooters to grab some snacks from the store, but what seemed like an ordinary outing quickly turned into something far darker. As time went on, the case unfolded with twists no one could have imagined, and its conclusion left many stunned. Michaela was born on January 24, 1979, in Oakland, California. She was her parents' first child after years of longing to start a family. Following 5 years of waiting, her parents welcomed 2 more children and eventually settled in the quieter town of Hayward. Life there was calm and family-oriented. Michaela grew up as a joyful, lively child who loved playing with her siblings and spending time with her best friend, Katrina. The girls lived just across the street from one another, which meant they spent much of their time together, playing and visiting each other's homes. On November 19, 1988, 9-year-old Michaela and her best friend Katrina were darting back and forth between their houses, trying on different outfits for an upcoming school performance. The morning was filled with excitement, made even better by the fact that Thanksgiving break had just begun. That same morning, Katrina's father handed her $1.05 to buy some candy. Overjoyed, the two friends hurried to Michaela's house to ask her mother for permission to walk to a nearby store, located less than a mile away. Michaela's mom hesitated at first, uneasy about letting 2 9-year-old girls go on their own since they had never made the trip without an adult before. Though the girls had visited the store many times before, it was always in the company of family or older neighbors. After some back and forth, Michaela's mother reluctantly agreed to let them go, but only under the strict rule that they buy their candy and return home right away. She worried especially about Michaela's safety, as she was their long-awaited first child, a true miracle in her parents' eyes. Still, Michaela's mother reassured herself that nothing could possibly go wrong. The store was only a short ride away, so the girls decided to take their scooters. Michaela ran over to Katrina's house, where they planned to use matching scooters, Katrina's own and one borrowed from her brother. When they arrived at the store, they left the scooters outside and went in to buy their treats. But once they stepped back outside, they became wrapped up in conversation and forgot all about their scooters. They began walking back home, but soon realized they had forgotten their scooters. Turning around, they hurried back to the store, only to discover that Michaela's scooter was missing. Believing someone might have moved it, the girls split up to search around the store from different directions. As Michaela made her way through the parking lot, she spotted her scooter leaning against a car parked just a short distance away. As she approached, Katrina was startled by a piercing scream. Rushing back, she saw a man forcefully grabbing Michaela and shoving her into the car beside the scooter. Within moments, the man jumped into the driver's seat and sped off. Stunned and terrified, Katrina ran back inside the store to alert the cashier, who immediately phoned the police. Officers arrived at the scene within minutes. The store clerk, who knew Michaela's father, also phoned him to explain what had happened. Michaela's father, joined by Katrina's dad, rushed to the store, where investigators were already gathering evidence. He asked his wife to remain at home by the phone in case the police needed to contact her. Detectives were met with obstacles right away. There were no surveillance cameras in the area, and the only eyewitness was Katrina, who was so traumatized she could barely describe what she had seen. Katrina's father was eventually permitted to take her home. The cashier then offered the first potential clue. She recalled seeing a suspicious man lingering outside shortly before the abduction. He had parked his car, stepped out, but never went inside. Instead, he paced along the storefront, peering through the windows as though keeping an eye on the girls. The cashier admitted she had a bad feeling, suspecting he might have been planning to rob her. Based on the cashier's account, the suspect was a white male, roughly 30 years old, with a noticeable mustache. He had driven an old maroon sedan, though the model and license plate couldn't be identified. Using this description, police produced a composite sketch and quickly released it to the media. News of Michaela's abduction spread rapidly, shocking the community and beyond that such a bold kidnapping could take place in a busy area of town. Authorities also circulated the sketch and vehicle description to hundreds of patrol officers across the county. Police began stopping any car that resembled the suspects in the desperate hope of rescuing Michaela alive. At the same time, detectives turned over her scooter to forensic specialists for analysis. They suspected the kidnapper had watched Michaela and Katrina arrive at the store, then intentionally moved one of the scooters near his car to set up the abduction. Investigators believed the kidnapper might have left fingerprints on the scooter, and sure enough, they discovered one that didn't match Michaela, Katrina, or their families. The problem, however, was that the print was only partial, making it nearly impossible to run through databases at the time. With technology still limited, police were forced to depend on direct comparisons with individuals who became suspects. By that same evening, the FBI had stepped in, as child abductions had recently increased not only in Hayward but in surrounding cities as well. Authorities feared Michaela's disappearance might be linked to the others. Yet, even with federal resources, heightened media attention, and a growing sense of urgency, the search produced little progress in finding the missing girl. Michaela's parents were shattered by the ordeal. Her mother, overwhelmed with guilt, blamed herself and remembered a disturbing moment that had taken place just a week before the abduction. One morning, Michaela had woken unusually early, sat at the kitchen table, and said she was writing a poem. This was unusual for her, as she was never an early riser. She explained that a noise in the attic had woken her and inspired her to write about people being kidnapped and hidden away in attics rather than killed. At the time, her mother dismissed it as strange musings for a 9-year-old, but after the abduction, it took on a chilling, almost prophetic meaning. She couldn't shake the thought that Michaela might have unknowingly foreshadowed her own fate. In the 2 days that followed, police mounted an exhaustive search for both the suspect and the missing girl. Despite their relentless efforts, investigators still found themselves with no solid leads on Michaela's whereabouts. Hoping for new insights, they returned to speak with Katrina, thinking that with a little time she might remember more. What they encountered instead was a baffling development. The description Katrina gave of the kidnapper was drastically different from the one provided by the cashier. Katrina recalled the man as being about 20 years old, with long, messy, light-colored hair that reached his shoulders and a face marked by pimples. She remembered his striking blue eyes, sharp and fox-like, which stood out in her memory. She also described the vehicle, a beige, boxy sedan riddled with dents. It soon became clear to police that the cashier had described an entirely different individual. Her account was based on the odd behavior of a man lingering near the store, while Katrina, who had actually witnessed the abduction, gave a completely different description of both the suspect and his car. This posed a major setback. The authorities had already released an inaccurate composite sketch to the media and patrol units, meaning countless people were searching for the wrong man. All of this happened during the crucial first 48 hours, the period when quick action is most likely to bring a child home safely. Acting on Katrina's details, investigators created a new composite sketch and distributed it widely. They also began questioning every man in the area with prior sexual offense convictions. Meanwhile, volunteers joined the effort, canvassing neighborhoods door to door in hopes that someone might recognize the suspect or offer a lead that could move the case forward. Thousands of flyers were printed with Michaela's photo and details of the abduction. Within just a few days, an astonishing 42,000 had been distributed. Soon after, investigators received their first promising lead. 3 hikers reported that while exploring a large national park near the city, they had noticed 2 sets of footprints, one belonging to an adult and the other to a child. Curious, the hikers followed the tracks deeper into the forest, where they eventually discovered a blanket and discarded fast food wrappers. Police took this information seriously, suspecting it could be linked to Michaela and her abductor. FBI profilers also noted that such a location fit the likely behavior of the kidnapper, as they believed he would choose a place far removed from civilization to hide his victim. Because of the park's vast size and its close distance to the city, it seemed to fit perfectly with the FBI's theory. Detectives launched a large-scale search, deploying every resource they had. Ground teams scoured the terrain while helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the area from above. Despite the massive effort, nothing was found. No trace of Michaela, nor any evidence of where she might have been taken. Searches later expanded to other parks, mountains, and remote areas, but every lead ended in disappointment. Meanwhile, the case drew national attention, generating an overwhelming flood of tips. In just the first month, investigators received nearly 4,000 reports to sift through. Trying to follow up on each one quickly became an enormous challenge. Michaela's disappearance was soon on everyone's mind, not only in Hayward, but also across San Francisco and nearby cities. Even prominent public figures stepped forward, urging citizens to share any information that might help the investigation. A large reward of $70,000 was announced, and Michaela's photo was soon printed on millions of milk cartons across the state. Despite the overwhelming community support and the sheer number of tips, detectives made little headway. By late December, 6 weeks after the abduction, the police admitted that their only progress was in having chased down thousands of leads. From that point on, the case stalled. For months, tips continued pouring in, and investigators pursued each one as best they could. Michaela's mother even carried out her own inquiries, researching similar cases and trying to piece together who might have taken her daughter. The family and authorities clung to the hope that Michaela was still alive and being held somewhere. Then, in 1991, detectives began focusing on a 43-year-old man named Timothy Binder, and the deeper they looked into his past, the more disturbing it appeared. Binder had already drawn attention before Michaela's disappearance because of his unsettling behavior. He had been sending money, gifts, and letters to numerous young girls. Some of these letters included Bible verses with phrases such as, "I have chosen you," and "be with me." Alarmed parents reported this to the police, which eventually led to Binder being questioned. He defended himself by claiming he only wanted to befriend the girls, believing they were lonely. But investigators uncovered a disturbing past. In 1985, he was dismissed from his job at Child Protective Services in Colorado after it was discovered that he had been gathering personal details about young girls. Later, he continued sending them money, gifts, and letters. When authorities searched his van, they found a collection of children's photographs along with Bible verses taped across the interior. Binder also had a previous arrest for attempting to lure 2 young girls into his van, though no charges were ever filed. His behavior grew stranger still. He was known to spend long periods visiting the graves of young girls at local cemeteries. But things took a far darker turn. Just 6 months before Michaela vanished, a 7-year-old girl named Amber went missing nearby. Soon after Amber's disappearance, Binder contacted her mother, offering his help and visiting her home frequently. He even sent a letter to the police predicting that the next child to go missing would be 9 years old. Months later, Michaela, who was 9, was abducted. Following her disappearance, Binder repeatedly phoned Michaela's mother, visited her house, and insisted on assisting with the search. But the disturbing pattern didn't stop there. In early December 1988, Binder mailed a Christmas card to an FBI profiler he had previously spoken with. The card showed an illustration of a girl holding up 4 fingers. Soon after, a 4-year-old girl went missing in the same town. Though these details were highly suspicious, they remained circumstantial. Still, detectives secured a warrant to search Binder's home, where he lived with his wife. The search, however, turned up nothing that directly connected him to any of the abductions. When the press reported on Binder's strange behavior, public suspicion quickly grew, with many convinced he was a serial killer. He and his family faced harassment and even attacks, prompting him to sue city officials for spreading false information, a case he eventually won. Detectives kept him under investigation for several months, but in the end, they found no solid evidence linking him to the crimes. Some investigators began to believe Binder wasn't actually a danger to children, and that his odd behavior might not have been connected to the abductions at all. As a result, police shifted their attention to other possible suspects. A significant lead didn't surface again until December 1992, 4 years after Michaela's disappearance. That's when an Indiana inmate serving time for robbery contacted authorities, claiming he knew who had abducted Michaela. The inmate alleged that he had even helped bury her body in the same park where evidence had once been found. At first, detectives dismissed his claims, but after he wrote a letter to a major San Francisco newspaper, the story went public. Facing sharp criticism, police eventually agreed to hear him out. The inmate not only promised to show them where Michaela was buried, but also to lead them straight to her killer. He was transported to California and joined police in a search effort. He claimed Michaela's body was buried in a gladiolus field, so officers concentrated their resources there. After 8 hours of digging, the inmate abruptly confessed that he had fabricated the entire story. He said his intention had been to give Michaela's family a sense of closure and help them move on. Both Michaela's relatives and investigators were outraged by the false claim. As punishment, the inmate received an additional 6.5 years on his sentence, nearly doubling his time in prison, and was also ordered in August 2000 to pay Michaela's family $6,000 in compensation. Around this time, a new suspect came into focus. Police arrested a man named Curtis Anderson, who was already under suspicion for the murder of a 7-year-old girl in Fargo the year before. He admitted to the Fargo murder and was sentenced to prison, but detectives suspected he might be linked to other similar crimes. For years, no solid evidence supported this theory, until Curtis, gravely ill, reached out to the FBI. Wanting to unburden himself before his death, he confessed to killing 13 additional girls and women, including 7-year-old Amber, who had gone missing just 6 months before Michaela. Curtis shared details specific enough to make investigators take his claims seriously. Still, the absence of physical evidence and the inability to recover the victims' bodies made it nearly impossible to prove. Regarding Michaela's disappearance, he denied any involvement, even though his car closely matched Katrina's description. FBI agents intended to keep questioning him, but Curtis died in 2012 before they could gather more information. Not long after, another possible suspect emerged. An inmate came forward, telling police that his associate, Loren Herzog, strongly resembled the composite sketch of Michaela's suspected abductor. Detectives took notice, as Loren and his partner had already been convicted of multiple murders they carried out together. Authorities believed the pair might have been responsible for as many as 19 killings, though only some could be proven. Just a month before the inmate's tip, Loren had taken his own life while in prison. Despite this, investigators pursued the lead. Photographs of Loren from his younger years did bear a striking similarity to the sketch, but that alone wasn't enough. To dig deeper, police excavated a well where Loren and his partner had previously disposed of their victims' remains. Inside, they uncovered thousands of bone fragments, which were carefully analyzed by forensic specialists. After thorough testing, experts confirmed the recovered bones came from 5 different girls, but none matched Michaela's DNA. Even after searching additional wells, investigators found no evidence tying Loren to her disappearance. Then, in 2018, the case took a new turn. A man named David Mitchell was charged with the 1986 murders of 2 women near Michaela's hometown. The breakthrough came through modern DNA technology. Biological material once found beneath the victim's fingernails couldn't be analyzed at the time, but advancements allowed investigators to link it directly to David. He was already serving time for the 1989 murder of his 39-year-old girlfriend. Detectives soon began looking into whether he might also be connected to Michaela's case, and they uncovered some compelling links. Investigators learned that David had been in the area at the time of Michaela's abduction. He also closely matched Katrina's description and drove a car similar to the one she remembered. Since David's fingerprints were already in police records, experts re-examined the partial print lifted from Michaela's scooter. With the help of modern technology, they made a breakthrough. The fingerprint was an exact match to David's. By 2020, as hopes of Michaela still being alive had all but faded, David was formally charged with her murder. He denied any involvement, and the case proceeded to trial in early 2023. During the preliminary hearings, the judge determined that there was enough evidence to move forward. David's attorney attempted to undermine the fingerprint evidence, arguing that its presence on the scooter didn't conclusively tie him to the murder. But given the circumstances, the claim appeared weak. After all, it was clear the kidnapper had deliberately placed the scooter beside his car to lure Michaela close enough to grab her. The defense also tried to dispute the murder charges by pointing out that Michaela's body had never been found, arguing there was no proof of her death. But in modern law, this claim carried little weight, as many convictions have been secured in cases where the victim's body was never recovered. The evidence against David was strong, and his long record of violent crimes only reinforced the case. At 16, he had broken into a home and assaulted a woman at knife point. He served just a year in prison before being released, only to attempt another assault on a different woman shortly afterward. That crime earned him another 2-year sentence. In May 1988, 7 months before Michaela vanished, David was released again, but soon arrested for robbing a store. He was sentenced to a year, yet freed just 1 month before Michaela's abduction. When news finally broke of his arrest decades later, Michaela's father traveled from another state to attend the press conference announcing that his daughter's kidnapper had been caught. Tragically, Michaela's mother, who had spent decades holding on to hope that her daughter was still alive, was unable to attend the announcement as she was battling cancer. Shortly after the arrest, she passed away, expressing gratitude that investigators had uncovered the truth before her final days. Police vowed to continue searching for Michaela's remains and even offered a $10,000 reward for any information that could lead to their discovery. David Mitchell's upcoming trial will cover 3 cases. Michaela's, along with the 2 murders linked to him through DNA found beneath the victim's nails. At first, prosecutors planned to seek the death penalty. However, after a change in district attorney, the new leadership decided not to pursue it. If David is convicted of all 3 murders, he will face several decades in prison rather than a true life sentence. This decision enraged the victims' families and stirred widespread media attention, leaving David's attorney as the only one who publicly supported the change. That said, David is already 62, making it highly unlikely he'll survive long enough to complete even the reduced sentence. What stands out most is how the correctional system repeatedly released him early, despite his record of violent crimes. Had he not been freed just a month before Michaela's abduction, her murder might never have happened, and she could still be alive today. On Halloween night, a woman stayed at home with her daughter for only a short while her husband stepped out to the store. But when he came back, he was confronted with a scene so horrific it could rival the darkest horror films. The sight was so disturbing that even seasoned police officers required psychological support afterward, having never faced anything like it before. The grim reality of this case left everyone involved deeply shaken. Doreen Herbert was born on November 29, 1952, in California, and grew up in a large family with 4 siblings. She was known for her kindness, optimism, and willingness to help others. From her school days, Doreen knew she wanted a career centered on caring for people. After completing college, she moved to San Francisco and began working as a physiotherapist. Doreen had always hoped to build a large family of her own, and before long, the chance arose. At 24, she met Michael Dennis, who worked at a factory near her clinic. The two quickly grew close, began dating, and within a few months decided to marry. In 1976, they welcomed their son, Paul. At first, their marriage seemed happy, but after Paul's birth, their relationship gradually began to fall apart. Within a year, the couple divorced. Paul remained with Doreen, though Michael was allowed to visit him regularly. Despite the separation, they managed to maintain a civil relationship. About a year later, Doreen met another man, Charles. Their relationship blossomed, and soon they married and relocated to San Jose, settling into a quiet suburban neighborhood. In 1979, their daughter, Diana, was born. Like Doreen, Charles shared the dream of raising a large family. Charles lovingly raised Paul as his own and was overjoyed when their daughter was born. But in February 1984, tragedy struck. Young Paul managed to climb over the fence surrounding their pool and fell into the water. Doreen, who was home at the time, realized what had happened too late. She pulled him out and immediately called an ambulance. Paul was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. After 10 days, doctors determined there was no hope of recovery and made the difficult decision to disconnect him from the machine. Doreen was shattered and overwhelmed with guilt, even though the police investigation confirmed it wasn't her fault. Despite the heartbreak, she found the strength to go on, with her little daughter giving her comfort and helping her cope with the loss. For years after the heartbreaking loss, the family finally had something to look forward to. Doreen and Charles had long hoped for another child, though 2 previous pregnancies had sadly ended in miscarriage. At last, Doreen became pregnant again, and this time everything progressed smoothly. They were expecting a baby boy, due in early November, just days away from Doreen's scheduled hospital visit. That Halloween evening, October 31st, the family joined in the neighborhood festivities. Houses were decorated, children dressed in costumes filled the streets, and candy was handed out at every door. Diana, only 4 years old, was eager to take part, and her parents couldn't say no. Although Doreen was 9 months pregnant, she went trick-or-treating with her daughter, while Charles stayed home to pass out candy to visiting children. The mother and daughter returned home shortly before 9 p.m. Charles mentioned to his wife that their candy supply was running low and decided to make a quick trip to the nearest store, not wanting the neighborhood children to go without treats. He left around 8:50 p.m. and came back roughly 15 minutes later. As he approached the house, he noticed the front door was slightly open, which immediately struck him as unusual. What he found inside was nothing short of a nightmare. Entering the home, Charles discovered Doreen lying on the floor in the hallway, surrounded by a large pool of blood. She showed no signs of life, and he quickly dialed 911. Moments later, he realized the horror was even greater. Inside the living room lay the body of their unborn child. Charles was overcome with shock, unable to process the devastation before him. For a brief moment, Charles wondered if Doreen might have suffered a miscarriage, but the truth was far worse. Lying near the baby's body was a severed human hand, one he instantly recognized as Doreen's. Horrified, he realized an intruder had attacked his family. Terrified for his daughter's safety, he frantically searched the house, fearing she too might have been harmed. The scene was so gruesome that as he ran through the blood-soaked floor, Charles slipped and fell. To his immense relief, he finally found Diana alive, trembling and hiding behind the sofa in the living room. When paramedics arrived, they detected a faint pulse in Doreen and rushed her to the hospital. Sadly, despite their efforts, she died in the ambulance before reaching medical care. The baby also did not survive. In addition to being forcibly removed from Doreen's womb, the infant had suffered multiple wounds from the attacker. Medical examiners determined that Doreen herself had been struck repeatedly with a long, sharp weapon, likely a sword or machete. Meanwhile, police searched the house, which looked more like the set of a gruesome horror film than a family home. The brutality of the scene was so overwhelming that several officers later required psychological counseling. Blood covered the floors, splattered the walls, and even reached the ceiling. Investigators combed through the house, but found no sign of the killer or any useful evidence outside. However, they did discover bloody footprints on the sidewalk, which ended abruptly in the middle of the road, leading them to believe the perpetrator had entered a car and fled. Not long after, officers uncovered another critical piece of evidence on the front lawn, a blood-stained wolf mask. They suspected it might have belonged to the killer, especially since Charles confirmed the family had never owned such a mask. The mask was sent to a lab for analysis, while investigators attempted to speak with Diana. Though the little girl was in deep shock, she was the only eyewitness and could provide vital information. Diana recounted that shortly after her father left for the store, there was a knock at the door. When Doreen opened it, she was confronted by a man wearing a wolf mask and wielding a long blade. He chillingly told her, "I'm going to kill you now." Doreen immediately screamed for her daughter to run, and Diana rushed to hide behind the sofa. Diana couldn't remember anything beyond hiding and then being found by her father. She was also unable to help police identify the attacker, since the man's wolf mask concealed his face. At first, investigators considered Charles a possible suspect. They found it suspicious that his quick trip to the store happened to coincide with the attack, as Doreen was assaulted only minutes after he left. When Charles returned, he had stepped in blood repeatedly, even slipping and falling, which left him covered in it. Police initially thought he might have done this deliberately to explain the stains on his clothes, but detectives soon uncovered several flaws in that theory. Most importantly, the bloody footprints leading away from the house clearly did not match Charles's shoes. Investigators also noted that the killer appeared to have entered a car parked on the road outside the house, yet no traces of blood were found in Charles's vehicle, nor was there evidence of an extra pair of shoes. Police visited the store Charles claimed to have gone to, and a staff member confirmed that he had indeed bought candy that evening, leaving little time for him to commit the crime. Surveillance footage from the store further supported his alibi, leading detectives to set aside suspicions against him for the time being. They then asked if he could think of anyone who might want to harm his family. Without hesitation, Charles pointed to Doreen's ex-husband, Michael. While Michael and Doreen had once maintained a civil relationship, Charles explained that everything changed after the drowning death of their son. Michael placed the blame squarely on Doreen, convinced that she had intentionally killed their son to sever ties with him. He even went so far as to file a civil lawsuit against her, attempting to hold her legally responsible for the boy's death, but the case was dismissed. Even during their marriage, Michael had sometimes behaved in unsettling ways. After their son was born, he frequently sank into bouts of depression and withdrew from both Doreen and the child. Doreen believed much of his behavior stemmed from unresolved childhood trauma. From an early age, Michael suffered from hearing problems and had to wear a large, cumbersome hearing aid. At the time, such devices were bulky and conspicuous, which made him a constant target of ridicule from other children. This experience left him deeply introverted, with few friends, and he generally avoided socializing, especially with women. Although meeting Doreen seemed to help Michael move past some of his struggles, he was never able to fully overcome them. This lingering turmoil played a major role in the couple's decision to divorce. After Doreen remarried, Michael grew increasingly resentful, especially over the fact that another man was raising his son. When Paul died, those feelings escalated into deep hatred toward his ex-wife. Around the same time, Michael also lost his longtime job, a blow that further worsened his state of mind. Taking all of this into account, detectives decided to visit his home and question him. While Charles's suspicions alone weren't enough to make Michael the prime suspect, the fact that he lived just 2 miles from Doreen's house was reason enough for investigators to check on him immediately. Officers reached Michael's home around midnight and noticed his pickup truck parked near the garage. When they shined a flashlight inside, they spotted what appeared to be blood on the steering wheel and keys. They knocked on the door but got no response. With the lights on inside and the sound of running water audible, they suspected Michael might be destroying evidence or washing blood-stained clothing. They kept knocking until Michael finally answered. He appeared calm, even after being told about his ex-wife's murder. He responded to their questions casually and let the officers inside without hesitation, despite them not having a warrant. Michael claimed he had gone to the store earlier in the day, returned home, and had not left since. He even signed papers granting police voluntary consent to search his house. As Michael reached for the pen to sign the consent form, investigators noticed a deep cut on his right hand. He explained that he had injured himself earlier while carving a Halloween pumpkin, but officers were skeptical. The wound looked fresh, and blood was still seeping from it. While some officers began searching the house, Michael accompanied another upstairs to retrieve his ID from the bedroom. When he reached toward the headboard of the bed, the officer immediately grew suspicious. Why would someone keep identification there? Upon checking, the officer found a holster hanging from the headboard with a loaded gun inside. The weapon was secured, and Michael was escorted downstairs. At the same time, other officers followed a trail of blood droplets that led them to the garage, where they discovered a washing machine and a pile of clothing stained with blood. That was enough grounds for an arrest, and Michael was taken into custody. Afterward, detectives and forensic specialists conducted a more detailed search of his home, looking for evidence that could tie him directly to the murder. Blood analysis would take several days, but in the meantime, investigators uncovered disturbing new findings. One was an empty box for a machete with an 18-inch blade. Medical examiners later confirmed that this type of weapon matched the wounds found on Doreen's body. Even more unsettling, police discovered 2 makeshift coffins inside Michael's house, leading them to suspect they had been prepared for Doreen and Charles. They also found body bags of the kind typically used by medical professionals, items Michael had no legitimate reason to possess. Taken together, the evidence painted a chilling picture. Police petitioned a judge for a warrant that would allow them to hold Michael longer, as without it, his detention could only be temporary. But the judge ruled the evidence too circumstantial, forcing authorities to release him. Just 3 days later, however, detectives received the crucial results from the lab. Forensic experts identified 2 different blood types at the crime scene. Most of the blood matched Doreen's, but a smaller portion was consistent with Michael's. This indicated he had injured himself during the attack. With this evidence in hand, the judge had no hesitation in granting an arrest warrant. Michael was taken back into custody and formally charged with the murder of his ex-wife and her unborn child. Detectives soon uncovered another key piece of evidence tying Michael to the crime. Interviews with his acquaintances revealed that he owned the very same type of wolf mask found near Doreen's house. He had even worn it to a Halloween party the previous year, and investigators located a photograph of him in the mask. To remove any doubt, they later found the exact clothing he wore in that photo inside his home. But the trail of the mask didn't stop there. To strengthen their case, Police questioned Doreen's neighbors about what they had seen that evening. Several children who were out trick-or-treating recalled noticing a man in a wolf mask standing across the street, staring at Doreen's house. Strikingly, they spotted him around 7 p.m. nearly 2 hours before the attack. Michael's trial began in July 1988, for years after the crime. At first, he entered a guilty plea, but later changed it. While he did not deny committing the murder, he argued that he should be found not guilty due to mental illness. A court-appointed psychologist determined that Michael did suffer from severe psychological issues. Michael claimed that the sight of children trick-or-treating on Halloween triggered painful memories of Paul's death, causing him to snap. He admitted that on the night of the murder, he went to Doreen's house armed with a machete. When she opened the door, he accused her of killing their son and declared his intent to murder her. Doreen immediately recognized him despite the mask and screamed for her daughter to run, just before he launched the attack. Michael maintained that he did not know she was pregnant, though many found this assertion highly questionable. Standing just 4 feet 11 inches tall, Doreen's pregnancy was impossible to miss. Her friends even joked that her belly made her look broader than she was tall. The prosecution argued that Michael knew exactly what he was doing and had carefully planned the crime. Detectives uncovered statements he had made to friends about wanting to kill his ex-wife and her husband, then dispose of their bodies in the bay. With the discovery of 2 coffins and body bags in his home, prosecutors suggested that Michael had indeed intended to follow through with this plan but abandoned it, possibly because he panicked or feared being caught if he stayed too long. At the trial, Doreen's daughter Diana also testified. By then she was 9 years old, yet she still remembered the horrific events clearly. Charles didn't want his daughter to endure the trauma of testifying, but as the only witness, her account was essential. The trial lasted a year, and in the end, Michael was found guilty of murdering both Doreen and her unborn child. He was sentenced to death, but while awaiting execution, California placed a moratorium on the death penalty. As a result, Michael remains imprisoned to this day, with little chance his sentence will ever be carried out. Years later, Diana admitted that the murder haunted her for most of her life, the memory never leaving her for even a moment. In time, she chose to forgive Michael, believing it was the only way to free herself from the weight of the past and protect her own sanity. A young woman, fresh out of school and excited about her first job, set out to another city for a work seminar, but she never arrived. When she failed to show up, police launched a search, and one unsettling lead after another began to surface. It soon became clear that something terrible might have happened to her. Yet, unraveling the mystery proved far more difficult than investigators initially thought. Nearly 30 years would pass before the truth finally came to light, and the revelation was nothing like what anyone had anticipated. Vera Lindbeck was born on April 12, 1972, in the small town of Sturtevant, Wisconsin. It was a quiet, uneventful place where, as the locals often said, nothing much ever happened, good or bad. Life moved at a slow pace, crime was rare, and the town was considered a safe and welcoming spot for families. Vera grew up there with her parents and younger brother. She attended the local school, where she was popular among her classmates for her kind and friendly nature. Music was one of her greatest passions. She played the violin in her high school orchestra. During those years, she began dating a boy named Kurt, and their relationship continued after graduation. By the summer of 1990, at 18 years old, Vera was already planning what direction her future might take. She planned on going to college, but hadn't yet decided on a specific career path, though she knew it would definitely involve music in some way. In the meantime, Vera took a job to save money before starting school. She began working in the office of a large company, and that July she was scheduled to attend a 3-day seminar on computer training. For Vera, this was a major step. Only weeks out of high school, she was preparing to travel on her own to Appleton, a city several hundred miles from home. Naturally, her parents were uneasy about the idea. The thought of their daughter making such a long trip alone and staying away for several days left them worried. In time, her parents accepted the idea. Vera was an adult now, and the seminar was an important step for her job. On the morning of July 17th, they helped her pack, handed her the family van, and watched as she set off on the road. She promised to call them as soon as she arrived at her hotel. But hours passed with no word from her. Growing increasingly uneasy, knowing the drive should have only taken a couple of hours, her parents' concern deepened. By evening, they phoned the hotel, only to learn that Vera had never checked in. Desperate, they began contacting her co-workers, friends, and anyone else who might have seen her that day, but no one had. Even so, her parents held on to hope. They wondered if perhaps she had changed her plans, maybe checked into another hotel or stayed with someone she knew. They decided to wait until morning, praying for good news. But when the seminar began and Vera never appeared, their worry turned to fear, and they finally called the police. At first, though, the investigation was minimal. Authorities issued a notice with a description of her van, but since Vera was legally an adult and there was no solid evidence of foul play, they chose not to begin a full-scale search right away. Another day passed with no sign of her, no calls to her parents, no appearance at the seminar, and still no trace of the van. Everyone was left in a painful state of uncertainty. The following day brought no progress, but on July 19th, police finally got a lead. They received a call about a van resembling Barrett's parked outside a supermarket in the small town of West Bend, roughly 65 miles from her home. Officers rushed to the scene and confirmed it was indeed her family's van. The doors were locked, and there was no trace of Barrett inside or nearby. Inside the vehicle, investigators found a receipt from a Walgreens just across the street. The timestamp showed it had been printed on July 17th, the day she vanished. When they spoke to the store clerk, the employee remembered Barrett clearly. She had come in alone around noon, appeared to be in good spirits, and nothing about her behavior seemed unusual. Other discoveries inside the van painted a much darker picture. The stereo and radar detector were gone, hinting at a possible robbery, but that was only the start. The interior was covered in cigarette ash, a significant amount considering Barrett didn't smoke at all. It was obvious that someone else had been inside the van, and the sheer volume of ash suggested they had lingered there for quite some time. Her belongings raised even more concern. Nearly everything she had packed for the trip was still inside. The red shirt she wore when she left home was found on the floor, but it was torn. The dress she intended to wear to the seminar was there too, along with her stockings, which had been tied into a knot. Even the shoes Barrett had worn when she left home were still inside. One more detail caught investigators' attention before her parents handed over the van. They had written down the mileage since her company was going to reimburse her travel costs. When police checked the odometer, they discovered an additional 461 miles, far more than the 65 miles it took to get from her home to that parking lot. This meant someone else had driven the van a much greater distance before abandoning it. Supporting that suspicion were two disposable coffee cups left behind, one from McDonald's and the other from Burger King. Since Barrett had likely only made it about 65 miles before something happened, detectives doubted she would have stopped at two different places just to grab coffee. These findings led investigators to believe that Barrett had likely been abducted rather than her van simply being stolen. The second theory seemed improbable. She had been missing for several days, and there was still no sign of her. To move forward, police began reconstructing her final known movements. They learned that Barrett hadn't left town right away after leaving home. Her first stop was at her boyfriend Kurt's place. He later told investigators that they chatted for a while about her trip and the seminar before she headed off. Kurt claimed he hadn't heard from her since, and police found nothing tying him to her disappearance. Still, detectives uncovered one detail of interest. Kurt had given Barrett a fairly expensive ring, one she was known to always wear. During the van's inspection, investigators discovered Barrett's ring tucked beneath one of the floor mats. Its placement suggested it had been deliberately hidden, since it was highly unlikely to have just slipped off her finger and ended up there on its own. If someone else had removed the ring, it raised another troubling question. Why would the perpetrator take the stereo and radar detector but leave behind such a valuable piece of jewelry? At the same time, forensic experts finished combing through the van and uncovered dozens of fingerprints. To narrow them down, police collected prints from Barrett's friends and family, which left only a few unidentified ones. Among them were prints on a coffee cup, the inside of a window, and on some cosmetic boxes. Those cosmetic boxes had been purchased at Walgreens, but without a suspect to match them to, the fingerprints didn't bring investigators any closer to answers. While police searched for leads, Barrett's family took matters into their own hands. They organized a massive search, rallying over 100 volunteers, speaking with local media, and scouring hundreds of miles along her intended route. They also managed to raise $75,000 as a reward for any information that could help find her. Despite numerous tips coming in over the next few weeks, none provided a real breakthrough. Then, on August 22nd, more than a month after she vanished, police got a call. A farmer driving along a rural road, about 18 miles from where Barrett's van had been discovered, had come across something. He spotted something odd in a ditch by the roadside and went to investigate. To his shock, he discovered a human body and immediately alerted the authorities. When officers arrived, they confirmed the remains were female. But because of the advanced decomposition, visual identification wasn't possible. Detectives strongly suspected it was Barrett, and dental record comparisons soon confirmed their fears. The body's condition prevented medical examiners from determining an exact cause of death, though strangulation was considered likely. What was beyond doubt, however, was that she had been murdered. Among the most haunting details was a strip of fabric from Barrett's own shirt, tied around her head to cover her eyes like a blindfold. This pointed to the likelihood that Barrett had been abducted and possibly kept alive for a short time. Still, the medical examiner determined her body had been in the ditch for more than a month, suggesting she was killed the very same day she disappeared. Sadly, finding her remains brought no real progress in uncovering who was responsible. Months slipped by with no significant developments. Detectives questioned several suspects, pursued new leads, and re-examined potential evidence, yet every path ended in disappointment. One theory investigators leaned toward was that Barrett fell victim to a robbery that spiraled out of control. They speculated that while she was inside Walgreens, someone broke into her van intending only to steal valuables before slipping away unnoticed. But when Barrett returned and interrupted the theft, the situation likely escalated. To avoid getting caught, the intruder may have chosen to abduct her, eventually killing her and leaving her body in a rural ditch. Supporting this theory was the van's odometer reading. Nearly 500 additional miles had been logged after she went missing, far more than the short distance between her home and the spot where the vehicle was abandoned. This pointed to the possibility that her killer spent considerable time driving the van before ditching it. Since robbery appeared to be the main motive, investigators began looking closely at people with histories of similar crimes. Their attention soon turned to a man named Craig, who had been linked to several car thefts near the area where Barrett was last seen. What really drew investigators to Craig was his pattern of behavior. He frequently used stolen vehicles to carry out other crimes, driving them around for a while before eventually abandoning them, a habit that closely mirrored the actions of Barrett's killer. As detectives probed deeper into his background, they uncovered a potentially significant detail. Shortly after Barrett vanished, Craig had been arrested for an armed bank robbery. When police searched his belongings, they discovered a bag containing a woman's hairbrush with strands of blonde hair caught in it. At the time, however, DNA analysis wasn't advanced enough to confirm whether the hair belonged to Barrett, leaving investigators without a definitive connection. While Craig did have the theoretical opportunity to commit the crime, that fact on its own wasn't nearly enough to establish his guilt. But just as things seemed to be moving toward charges, a critical problem arose. Craig's fingerprints weren't a match for any of those recovered from Barrett's van. Despite his friend's damning statement, Craig flatly denied any role in the crime. Without physical evidence tying him to the murder, investigators were left grasping for a way to strengthen their case. For months, they pursued every possible lead, hoping something new would surface. Yet nothing substantial emerged. At one stage, police even considered filing charges against Craig based solely on his friend's testimony, banking on it being enough to convince a jury. But without hard evidence to back it up, the risk of the case collapsing in court loomed large. In the end, investigators concluded that without solid evidence, taking Craig to trial would almost certainly fail. Still, he remained their main suspect, and for years detectives kept searching for anything that could definitively link him to Barrett's murder. But despite their persistence, the case stalled for decades with no major breakthroughs. That changed in 2013, when the investigation was reassigned to a cold case unit for a fresh look. As the new team combed through the files and preserved evidence, they quickly ran into a major setback. Several of Barrett's clothing items, which should have been stored in evidence, were missing even though they were documented in the official records. It appeared they had been mistakenly discarded, likely by an officer. Even so, the cold case unit pressed forward, sending the remaining evidence for forensic testing and requesting a new fingerprint comparison against updated databases. To their surprise, detectives realized that in the 23 years since Barrett's murder, the fingerprints had never been digitized. They were still only kept on paper. Once the prints were finally uploaded into the system, everything changed. The lab quickly contacted the lead detective with major news. 5 of the fingerprints from Barrett's van matched a man named Dennis Brenner. This was the first time his name had surfaced in the case. Investigators soon uncovered that Dennis had a long criminal history, which explained how his fingerprints were already in the system. In his younger years, he had served time for car theft and was later arrested for breaking into a home. In another unsettling incident, he broke into a hotel room where a woman was staying, stole her underwear, and left behind disturbing notes. One incident in particular stood out to detectives because of its chilling similarity to Barrett's disappearance. Dennis had once broken into his ex-wife's car while she was at work and hid inside, waiting for her to return. When she got in, he pulled a knife and attempted to abduct her. Luckily, she managed to escape and reported him to police. As investigators continued digging, they learned that at the time of Barrett's murder, Dennis was employed as a long-haul truck driver in the very same region. His routes took him through numerous towns and cities, giving him countless opportunities to prey on unsuspecting victims. Still, detectives proceeded carefully. They first confirmed that Dennis had no personal connection to Barrett or her family, which could have explained why his prints turned up in the van. But one critical detail stood out as impossible to dismiss. One of Dennis's fingerprints was discovered on a box of cosmetics Barrett had bought just minutes before disappearing. This placed him in the van at the critical moment, raising serious suspicions. Investigators decided it was time to confront him and went to his home. At first, Dennis denied any involvement in Barrett's murder, insisting he had never even met her. But when detectives revealed that his fingerprints had been found inside her van, his composure cracked. He grew visibly anxious, at times breaking into tears as he tried to answer their questions. Still, he clung to his claims of innocence, which only pushed detectives to dig deeper. When they began speaking with people who knew Dennis, they uncovered several unsettling details. Dennis's ex-wife revealed that he had a strong preference for Burger King and went there often. Barrett, on the other hand, favored McDonald's. This detail stood out because investigators had discovered cups from both fast food chains in her van, and Dennis's fingerprint was found on the Burger King cup. When detectives questioned his former co-workers, they uncovered an even more disturbing piece of information. After Barrett's murder, Dennis briefly worked at a factory. Several colleagues remembered him keeping a photo of a young blonde woman in his toolbox. While the years made it impossible to confirm whether the woman was Barrett, they all remarked on the striking resemblance. Another co-worker shared an unsettling memory. Dennis had once told her outright that he wanted to kidnap and assault her. As investigators pressed forward, the forensic lab delivered a breakthrough. Among the few preserved items from Barrett's van was a cigarette pack wrapper. With modern technology, analysts uncovered another fingerprint, this one also matching Dennis. Piece by piece, the case against him was strengthening. After nearly a year of compiling evidence and testimony, authorities moved forward. In March 2015, Dennis was arrested and formally charged with Barrett's murder. Still, the prosecution faced a major hurdle. While Dennis's fingerprints placed him inside Barrett's van, they didn't definitively prove he had killed her. By 2015, juries often expected DNA as the ultimate proof in criminal cases, while fingerprints left more room for interpretation. The defense could argue that Dennis had entered the van under unrelated circumstances, leaving doubt as to whether he was actually responsible for Barrett's death. Despite exhaustive forensic testing, no DNA linked Dennis to Barrett, her van, or her belongings. Even so, prosecutors pressed forward, and the trial began in the summer of 2016. From the start, Dennis's defense attorney seized on the weakness of the case: fingerprints. He argued that while they proved Dennis had been inside the van, they did not prove murder. With no DNA or eyewitness testimony, the defense managed to plant enough doubt in the jurors' minds. In the end, they couldn't reach a unanimous verdict, and the trial collapsed into a mistrial. The decision was devastating for Barrett's loved ones, who had already endured 26 years of unanswered questions. Now, they faced the agony of watching the man investigators were convinced had killed her walk away without punishment. Still, prosecutors weren't ready to give up. Almost immediately, they announced their intention to retry Dennis. The second trial was set for early 2018, but it promised to be just as difficult, if not more. Prosecutors contended that Dennis had attacked Barrett with the intention of assaulting her before killing her. But proving that intent beyond a reasonable doubt turned out to be nearly impossible. The weight of his potential sentence hinged on this argument, putting the prosecution in a risky position. If the jury wasn't convinced, Dennis could be acquitted entirely and never face trial again. After long discussions and consultations with Barrett's family, the prosecution made a difficult choice. They offered Dennis a plea bargain. He would plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter. The deal guaranteed prison time, though far less than a murder conviction would have carried, and it allowed the case to finally reach closure. After 28 years, Dennis accepted the agreement. He received the maximum penalty for the charge, 10 years behind bars. Taking into account the time Dennis had already served since his arrest, his sentence amounted to just 7 years in prison. This meant he would be released at 71 years old. Barrett's parents were deeply disappointed by what they saw as a lenient punishment, yet they knew that without the plea deal, Dennis might have avoided accountability altogether. Reluctantly, they agreed to the compromise, seeing it as the only way to secure at least some measure of justice for their daughter. In her memory, they created a scholarship at her high school, awarded to students who excel in music, a tribute that continues to this day. Years later, investigators also succeeded in disproving the testimony against Craig, the original suspect, finally clearing his name. As it turned out, the acquaintance who claimed Craig had shown him Barrett's body inside the van had fabricated the story. He had a personal grudge against Craig and used details he had overheard from the police investigation to falsely implicate him.